since 1922. Unitas, an open-access journal, is the oldest extant multidisciplinary journal in the Philippines. In 1922, the University of Santo Tomas main building was constructed. Considered as one of the historical symbols in UST that also represented the height of civilizational achievement in the Philippines. The main building was not born by itself in the year 1922. The academic journal Unitas was founded in the same year. Through the years, Unitas has been witness to the nation's history, same as its twin, the main building which would be known as the heart of the university. During the so-called peacetime of the interwar years, Unitas has the courage to speak about the urgent issues of the day, as well as from the state-of-the-art in fine scholarly theorizing in the arts and published scholarly articles included on the incubation period of the infection typhoid, a series of articles on the indigenous church, problems of working-class legislation in the Philippines, the socialistic dream, the fine arts and aesthetic pleasure, the Philippines woman and her influence in the future. During the early American period, the same year when Unitas broke into academic publication scene, 3 other journals came into limelight. The Philippine Journal of Science, established in 1906 by the American government, had its interest in scientific research only. The Philippine Agriculturalist and Forester, established in 1911 by UP Los Baños, was founded by the student body of the College of Agriculture and Forestry. The University of the Philippines and its Los Baños branch was similar to college student publication until it developed as an academic journal publication for Philippine agricultural scientists. The Philippine Law Journal, established in 1914 by UP College of Law, was founded by the student-run Law Review affiliated in UP Diliman. The publication was designed as a vital training tool for law students and modeled after the student-edited law reviews of American Law School. In the late 1940s, shortly after World War II, while UST served as an internment camp, Unitas continued in the publication of research and journals, not only about the relevant disciplines, but also on Filipino society, the nation, and in the world. Various multidisciplinary publications were held in Unitas. Some of its examples are in the fields of economics, architecture, and international research series from Indonesia, the Middle East, and India. Today, Unitas has expanded its arena to scholarly international conferences and publications, not just through traditional publication, but also shifted to open access online journals. Unitas will celebrate its centenary in 2022. Looking into the rich history of the journal itself has been made possible by the UST Heritage Library Collections, which has painstakingly scanned all copies of Unitas starting from its very first issue published in July 1922. This was done for the preservation and digitalization of the journals and for the convenient perusal of specialists, scholars, and general readers. As the oldest university-based multidisciplinary journal of its kind in the Philippines and possibly in Asia, Unitas is a rich source of information and insights in understanding various aspects of the history of knowledge production in the Philippines across the disciplines. Unitas is an international online peer-reviewed open access journal of advanced research in literature, culture, and society, published biannually, May and November, by the University of Santo Tomas.
Magandang umaga. This is Nico Vitug. Welcome to the third installment of the Unitas Authors International Lecture Series, a part of the year-long celebration of Unitas as it turns 100 years old. Today's event is held in cooperation with Cultural, Literary, and Art Studies Society Incorporated, or CLAS, and Critica Cultura, or KK, of the Ateneo de Manila University. This event is co-sponsored by the Department of Literature of the University of Santo Tomas, or UST, where Unitas Journal is housed. The Authors International Lecture Series follows a classroom lecture-style forum of the authors that have been published in the journal. Since the first issue of Unitas in July 1922, it has expanded the arena of its scholarly, even linguistic conversations with the rest of the world of scholarship. Particularly this time, we are aiming to capture new readers from the ranks of younger scholars, students, and researchers. Under the journal's new initiatives and leadership, Unitas has moved forward by leaps and bounds. It has transformed from a local and national journal to an international scholarly publication. In the process, it modernized its concept and format and upgraded itself as an all-around international journal. Such a transformation befits a journal with an especially long and distinguished history from which one can trace back exciting and illuminating vignettes of the intellectual history of a people. This transformation would not have been possible without the editorial support and scholarly advice of the still expanding International Editorial Board, consisting of leading international scholars in their specific fields, from Asia to the United States to Europe and South America. Neither would it have been realized without the administrative support and encouragement right from the outset of UST's rector, the Secretary General, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Letters, the Chair and Faculty of the Literature Department, and most especially the staff members of Unitas. We and UST know that there is no Unitas as we know it today without the unwavering commitment and single-minded vision of the journal's new editor-in-chief, who has been the dynamic scholar in residence as well, which is an office that is based in the Faculty of Arts and Letters. Our guiding light is no other than Professor Maria Luisa Torres Reyes. Today, Unitas is known worldwide through its issues, which are published online and open access, and its active membership in a national and international network of scholars and professional organizations through the initiative of our editor-in-chief. Wherever in the world she travels, she proudly carries the Unitas banner with her, as she had done with Ateneo's Critica Cultura in another life, and continues to do so as its editor emerita. Under Ma'am Lulu's leadership, the centennial year celebration in 2022 will be highlighted by several milestones, including the publication of the special centennial issue, for which contributions will be exclusive to the members of the International Board, and which is supposed to be released in July, and the formal organization by Unitas and the scholar in residence of the network of journals in Asia to be called Asian Journals Network, or AJN, whose founding members are the editors and staff members of academic journals from the Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, China, Korea, and Taiwan, slated in August. And the digitalization of all UNITAS issues from 1922 to 2022, which will be our gift to the loyal readers worldwide by way of providing them with the convenience of a scholar-friendly archival research. You are all invited, ladies and gentlemen. Today's installment of the UNITAS Lecture Series, or Authors International Lecture Series, is titled The Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Response to Climate Change. Let me read the abstract for you. Sustainable development is an ambition rather than a reality. Profound changes will be needed to achieve it in ways of producing and consuming. This will only happen at scale if societies undergo major cultural changes, including placing greater value on undervalued natural assets and internalizing in individual decisions the costs they impose on the environment, including the climate system. For these changes to occur, societies need to become more equitable, ensuring that all members enjoy decent living standards and are thus willing and able to attach greater weight to the well-being of future generations. This morning's speaker is Dr. David O'Connor, who served as Chief of the Policy and Analysis Branch of the United Nations Division for Sustainable Development for more than a decade. In that capacity, Dr. O'Connor led the team which supported substantively the formulation and negotiation of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. He has published in peer-reviewed journals on the co-benefits of climate policy in emerging economies. He has taught economics at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and the Ateneo de Manila University. He holds a PhD from University College London, an MS from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and his Bachelor of Arts, summa cum laude, from Yale University. Without further ado, let us welcome Dr. David O'Connor.
Magandang umaga, mga kaibigan, kalugkuro, estudyante, at iba pa. I'm honored to have been invited to address this august forum, the UNITAS 100 International Lecture Series. I will discuss the topic, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Response to Climate Change, which is an adaptation of my article in the UNITAS Journal special section on culture and the environment in November 2021. Let me begin. Economic development has been the holy grail of all countries since the middle of the last century, that is after World War II, in the era of post-war reconstruction and decolonization. It's a subject which has fascinated me and no doubt many of you, whatever your specialization, throughout my career. After all, the Philippines has been struggling to develop and raise people out of poverty to become a developed country throughout this period. That task is far from done, as you know better than I. Yes, the Philippines has managed to triple per capita income, or GDP, from 1960 to 2019, before the pandemic, to $3,365 in purchasing power parity terms, according to the World Bank's data. But it has struggled at times, with income per capita falling by almost a quarter in the dying days of the Marcos regime in the first half of the 1980s, for example. It has also taken a recent dip as a result of COVID, but proportionally the decline is much smaller than in the first half of the 80s. Yet even as Philippine per capita income tripled, that of the East Asia and Pacific region as a whole increased almost tenfold, which is a sobering contrast. In the recent past, the Philippines has managed to make its economic development more inclusive, reducing the national poverty rate by almost 7 percentage points from 2015 to 2018, when it stood at 16.7%. Also, inequality has fallen somewhat over this period, with the poorest 40% of the population experiencing average income growth of 6.1% per year, compared to 3.4% average income growth for all households. So the bottom of the distribution has been getting relatively wealthier. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has partially reversed this progress. But I'm not going to dwell on the effects of COVID-19 today. I'm going to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on climate change. While the causal link to Philippine progress on poverty and inequality reduction may be tenuous, 2015 also marks the beginning of a new era in development thinking and practice, one designed to take into account the failures of past development models, which generally ignored distributional justice concerns and completely ignored environmental concerns, and in particular the challenge of climate change. In September of 2015, the world's leaders came to the United Nations in New York to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Then in early December of that year, governments convened in Paris, France, to sign the Paris Agreement on climate change. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the 17 SDGs. I hope all, but that may be too much to hope for. I suspect most of you are at least broadly familiar with the Paris Agreement. I will argue here that these two, the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, are intimately linked. Why? For two main reasons. First, we cannot realistically hope to be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I'll just refer to them as the SDGs for short from here on in a world experiencing worsening climate change. Poverty and hunger cannot be eradicated in such a world. We cannot expect countries to be able to achieve shared prosperity when they are struggling with ever more extreme natural disasters, crop failures, mass migration, and other knock-on effects of climate change. The Paris Climate Agreement is meant for the international community to tackle climate change to forestall these disastrous outcomes. Whether it is succeeding is another matter, which I will address later. Second, we cannot expect societies to be willing and able to take the drastic steps needed to tackle climate change if they remain deeply unequal, and if the lion's share of the costs of action, for example, of decarbonizing economies, falls on the poor and vulnerable. Societies and economies must tackle inequalities, be more inclusive, leave no one behind. That is the message of the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda. That is their raison d'etre. If they fail, then we can expect strong popular resistance to the kinds of measures needed to end our addiction to fossil fuels, to decarbonize our economies. The International Labor Organization of the UN and the trade union movement have come to refer to a just transition towards net zero carbon emissions by mid-century, which is what the Paris Agreement aims to achieve, that the global economy will have net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Of course, opposition to strong measures to tackle climate change comes from various quarters. Probably the most potent opposition is from the fossil fuel industry itself and its lobbyists in the capitals of the world. Industry scientists have understood the science of human-caused climate change and the role of burning fossil fuels for decades. The only problem is that their bosses have systematically suppressed the science and sown confusion and doubt in the public that humans are actually causing climate change. Well, that era is gone. The science now is overwhelming, as the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change makes plain, published just 2 weeks ago. So the terrain has shifted. The fossil fuel industry has reluctantly had to embrace renewable energy while continuing to obstruct the more rapid transition away from fossil fuels to be able, hopefully, to extract that last drop of oil from the ground before they have to give it up. For them, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a godsend. Look what has happened to the price of oil on world markets. The new terrain on which the climate change battle is now being fought is that of economics. It's no longer the science, it's the economics. For those economists in the audience, this is the battle of a lifetime. Because economics is the last refuge of the scoundrel. The argument goes something like this. Oh yes, we realize that burning fossil fuels uncontrollably is very bad for the world's climate. We would like to help you by ending the exploration, pumping, mining, and burning. But that would be very costly, not just for us companies, but for our workers and for the whole economy. Too expensive considering the benefits, which are only going to be realized in the future by people as yet unborn, in parentheses, and incidentally, without any vote. Except that this logic is being proven wrong each and every day. As the costs of alternative energy, solar, wind, and other renewables continue to plummet, and as the cost of inaction mount, not in some distant future, but now. First, on the cost of renewables, solar photovoltaics have seen the steepest price decline, a roughly 8-fold price decline over the past decade. But other renewable electricity sources have seen declines as well. They're increasingly competitive with coal in power generation. With some 800 gigawatts of existing coal capacity, that's almost the size of the total coal generating capacity of the United States, now being more costly to operate than new solar PV or onshore wind capacity, which is commissioned in 2021, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency. The unspoken subtext of the fossil fuel apologists is, well, yes, some people are suffering now from climate change, but those are mostly poor people in small and insignificant countries and economies. We in the rich world can absorb the costs of adapting to climate change without much disruption to our way of life, by which they mean don't interfere significantly with our gas guzzling, carbon and methane belching consumption and production patterns. Even the last part of this argument, that rich countries will be able to weather climate change fairly easily, is being increasingly challenged by facts on the ground. Massive forest fires and droughts in the Western United States and Australia, extreme weather events in Canada, the Midwestern and Eastern United States and Europe. In the United States, for example, 3 of the 6 years with the most costly weather-related disasters since 1980 have happened in the past 5 years. And each of those has caused damages exceeding $100 billion. In 2017, one of those 3 years, the damages exceeded $300 billion. This is from NOAA, the US government. The reinsurance company Swiss Re produced a study last year projecting that if global mean temperature is not held to below 2 degrees Celsius rise over the pre-industrial level this century, the world economy could lose between 10 and 20% of its output by 2050 compared to a world without climate change. So it might seem rational from an economic perspective to take strong action now to tackle climate change, to transition towards a net zero global economy by 2050, as well as to invest in adapting to the inevitable impacts of climate change, which is already baked in because of carbon dioxide's long resident life in the atmosphere and the already high global concentrations by historical standards. For example, CO2 concentrations have increased from an annual average of 280 parts per million in the late 1700s, that's before the Industrial Revolution, to 410 parts per million in 2019, a 46% increase. Magandang umaga, mga kaibigan. Where are we now then? The numbers do not add up. Codification or protocols like the Kyoto Protocol, and not to be bound legally by those nationally determined contributions. Moreover, those nationally determined contributions are quite different from the legally binding emissions reductions targets that countries agreed to in the Kyoto Protocol, which is the predecessor of the Paris Agreement, and which was essentially a failure. It was a failure in large part because it applied only to developed countries who were not willing to meet their commitments to reduce emissions, as long as countries like China were not asked to do likewise. So this kind of voluntary or quasi legal approach was the only way to reach agreement on the Paris Accord, not least because any treaty modification or protocol like the Kyoto Protocol would have required ratification by national legislatures. And the US Congress, I'm sure amongst others, was not about to agree to legally binding emissions reductions targets. It never agreed to the Kyoto Protocol in the first place. So where are we now then? The numbers do not add up. Countries have made their nationally determined contributions, and if you add all of those contributions, they don't add up. The offers combined still put the world on a climate collision course, with a global mean temperature rise this century projected to be 2.6 to 2.7 degrees Celsius, way above the Paris target of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. Moreover, developing countries have indicated that they're only willing to be more ambitious in their commitments, in their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, if they receive support from developed countries in the form of financing to help them make the transition away from fossil fuels, which is a reasonable request given that they are poorer and many such countries did not contribute significantly to the problem of climate change historically. Regrettably, the developed countries are falling short on their end of the bargain. Going all the way back to Copenhagen in 2009, and then reaffirmed in the Paris Agreement, developed countries had promised to mobilize $100 billion a year in climate finance for developing countries by 2020, and then to look at that number and think about raising it thereafter. But as of 2019, they were about $20 billion short, according to OECD estimates. So ambition needs to be raised all around on climate change by all countries in their nationally determined contributions to make their collective pledges consistent with staying below 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise over this century compared to pre-industrial levels, and by developed countries on the financing front to show good faith and establish confidence in developing countries that they will not be left on their own to finance their transition away from fossil fuels and to adapt to climate change. As I said earlier, many of these countries, with China being an exception, of course, and a few other of the G20 countries being exceptions, most of these developing countries had very little to do to contribute to the problem in the first place. And the Philippines is one of these, which has had very little to do with contributing to climate change, but is, of course, one of the most vulnerable countries. So returning to the SDGs and the 2030 agenda, this piece of soft law or voluntary agreement, why should it matter? Why should the SDGs and the 2030 agenda matter? They're, after all, not binding. Why should countries even take them seriously? Well, they cover a very broad range of development and environment concerns if you look at the 17 goals. And it is precisely their breadth which serves to remind us that as important as climate change is to address, It's only part of what we need to do to achieve shared prosperity with healthy people living on a healthy planet. In other words, sustainable development. The SDGs cover everything from poverty and hunger eradication to health and education, to gender equality and broader social and economic equality, to clean water and clean energy, even sustainable cities. They also address the environmental challenges humanity faces. Not only climate change, but pollution of the world's fresh water and oceans, deforestation, and the loss of biodiversity. Moreover, the beauty of the SDGs and 2030 Agenda is that they show how these different worthy objectives or goals are interlinked. For example, we now have strong evidence that COVID-19 has been caused by a virus transmitted from wild animals to humans, possibly through illegal wildlife trade. So human health and the health of the natural world are inextricably linked. Many other infectious diseases of the recent past have similar animal origins, so-called zoonotic diseases. And the only way to limit the risk of new zoonotic diseases in the future is to reshape our relationship to other species and to the natural world. We must end deforestation and other forms of nature destruction and restore nature where it has been severely degraded. This will be good for human well-being directly. It will also help us in our fight against climate change and its impacts. Forests absorb and store carbon, as do mangroves. And so protecting them where they still exist or growing them back where they have been destroyed can help to reduce global carbon emissions. Moreover, mangrove forests help coastal communities withstand the storm surges that come with certain extreme weather events like typhoons, which are being made more powerful by climate change. Investment in nature is investment in human well-being, in sustainable development. This is one of the powerful messages of the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda. Another very important message of these documents, of the 2030 Agenda and the 17 SDGs, is that our world is an interdependent world, and no country can achieve sustainable development on its own. In the 2030 Agenda, all countries of the world have agreed to work together to achieve sustainable development. But how? Through strengthened multilateral cooperation and international partnership. For example, if you look at the countries which always rank at the top of any sustainable ranking, whether tax network and in Europe, which rank at the top. Found the secret sauce for sustainable development? Well, they are clearly doing some things right. For example, many have strong social protection systems for their vulnerable populations. Many have progressive policies regarding women's participation in the economy and decision-making. And many have invested heavily in renewable energy. But they are not without their own challenges or shortcomings. For one of the reasons they have been able to reduce the energy intensity and the carbon intensity of their economies is that they import many, if not most, of their energy intensive manufacturers from elsewhere, first and foremost from China. So some of China's greenhouse gas emissions are going to produce manufactured exports to Northern Europe and the USA and Japan. And a large part of Brazil's soybeans, which are fueling deforestation in the Amazon, contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and loss of biodiversity, are going to feed Chinese cattle and pigs. In short, no country is an island, and therefore no country can hope to achieve sustainable development on its own. We must come together and cooperate. Yet the international community in the current climate seems farther than ever from cooperation. So are we doomed to fail in our quest for sustainable development? I would like to be able to tell you that I have an answer to that question, but I don't. Do you? I'd like to open it up for discussion and hear your answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. O'Connor, for your very engaging discussion on the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and their relation to climate change. Definitely, it is necessary for us to be more aware of the geopolitical terrain and even the local terrain in individual countries, and how all of these affect and are affected by the state of our environment. The SDGs are not mere reminders, but are points that need to be threshed out and problematized from economics, politics, and other fields, perhaps redefining what it means to think of an ecological outlook. So before we begin the open forum, I'd like to say hello to our audience. Ms. Amihan Dumagit earlier gave a greeting to everybody. So good morning, ma'am. And of course, the Tomasian students, teachers, and students, hello. If it's possible, have a nice react on our Facebook page, a heart or something. And then also from those who came from the provincial provinces to provincial universities to join us, like Holy Name or Holy Angels in Pampanga, and also Silliman University, I believe, signed up. So yeah, do give a react to our live streaming today. So good morning, everybody. So we now are at the open forum, and we would like to engage all of you in this conversation. Please be reminded to key in your questions or remarks at the comments section. Now, let's have questions coming from the audience. Let me take a quick look if there's already a question. Okay, so since I think people are just warming up, no pun intended in relation to climate change, Dr. O'Connor, I'd like to ask a question that came up when I was re-listening to your talk, sir. When you gave a very broad overview of the situation and how countries actually depend on suppliers in relation to climate change, in relation to the purchase of gas. And I think I remember that one of the comments I heard recently was Prime Minister Boris Johnson being hesitant about refusing to buy Russian gas. I will not ask a question immediately about that, but I would like to focus more on your being experienced in Philippine matters because you taught in the Philippines. And since you're with the UN, we also talk about economics and diplomacy. Sir, how do you think, what kind of factors are we looking at here in the Philippines in relation to diplomacy, trying to forward sustainable development goals and climate change? Are there challenges in relation to politics, economics here in the country that are particularly Philippine? And I'd actually like to contrast how different our ideal response to SDGs are here in this country as compared to what's happening abroad, sir.
Thank you, Nico. Can people hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Let me start with the first part of your question about gas and oil and the current state of the global markets and oh, sorry, refresh my video. How do I refresh my video? Sorry.
Okay, so at the moment, Dr. O'Connor is just trying to refresh his video. So he's about to respond to the question on Philippine situations and the SDG. So Dr. O'Connor?
Okay, is that better?
Much better, sir.
Okay, thanks. So regarding oil and gas, well, as you know, I mean, if we are to address climate change as an international community, it will require that we phase out over time our consumption of oil and gas because and of coal, not just oil and gas. Of course, coal pollutes more than oil and gas per unit of energy, and it's more widely used in electricity generation in some parts of the world. I believe the US, that the Philippines also uses coal, but China is heavily dependent on coal, as is India, two of the largest greenhouse gas emitters in the world. And Indonesia exports coal, and so many economies depend on fossil fuels in one way or another, either exporting them like Russia, or consuming them, or both. The United States, of course, still depends heavily on fossil fuels. So does Germany. So does much of Europe. Only a couple of countries have managed to basically limit their dependence on fossil fuels. And those are either dependent on nuclear energy, like France, or have abundant hydroelectricity, like Brazil, or in the case of the United Kingdom, basically depleted their natural gas in the North Sea, and also decided that they were going to break the back of the coal miners, and so basically phased out their dependence on coal and more recently natural gas, and are increasingly relying on renewable energy. But Germany is struggling, and Germany is a particularly challenging situation because it tried to it has actually phased out nuclear energy, more or less, but it can't afford not to import gas from Russia because it's a very large share, almost half, I think, of Europe. Half of Europe's gas supply comes from Russia. So I think in Germany it's larger. So if you're going to heat people's homes in the winter, if you're going to give them cooking fuel and so on, there's really little alternative. Although the International Energy Agency just recently published a 10-point plan for reducing Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas. Part of that is to switch to other sources of gas, including domestic supply and liquefied natural gas from the United States and elsewhere. But it also is trying to accelerate the introduction of renewable energy, of wind and solar. Of course, much of Europe is not very sunny much of the time, so solar energy is a challenge. Wind is not such a challenge in parts of Europe, but still, biomass and other sources of renewable energy are also options in parts of Europe. So reducing the inefficiency in the use of electricity and energy is another way to try to reduce dependence on imported oil and gas. But of course, that's not going to solve the problem that we face of the current geopolitical situation, because yes, Europe depends heavily on Russian oil and gas, but China is the biggest importer of both. And so, Russia will still have quite a bit of revenue, including from China, but also from Kazakhstan and Belarus and other countries who are heavy users of Russian oil and gas. So that's not a solution, but you could see a silver lining, I suppose, in all of this crisis that the world faces at the moment, insofar as this is forcing countries to accelerate their shift away from dependence on fossil fuels, because it's become a political liability, a geopolitical liability now, as well as a liability from the perspective of climate change. And so that has given an additional incentive to countries to try to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. Now, as far as the Philippines is concerned, I don't know if it is importing oil from Russia, maybe, because Russia is a big oil exporter, so I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know what the situation is, honestly, of renewable energy in the Philippines. I know that the Philippines has a large endowment of sunshine. That much I'm sure of, because I spent enough time there to know of that. But and wind, for that matter, in many parts of the country. But it's also a very densely populated archipelago, or I guess series of islands. It's not technically an archipelago, but and so finding the space, for example, for solar power, you need space. You need, somewhere to put the solar panels. And so that is, of course, a challenge. There may be other ways to generate renewable energy in the Philippines. I mean, Philippines has had hydro. I don't know how much untapped hydro potential it still has. It has geothermal. So there are options there. But of course, it's a stretch for any country to try to substitute fully for the fossil fuels that it has relied upon for so long, because renewable energy, is not as efficient in, generating power, energy from a very compact source. So a highly densely concentrated source of energy like fossil fuels. So all countries are challenged, but developing countries are particularly challenged because, they haven't the resources necessarily to invest in switching away from fossil fuels. If they have large installed capacity, coal-fired power plants, for example, you can't just scrap those overnight without losing significant amounts of investment, unless they've been, fully amortized. And so, so they need help. They need financial support from the international community, from the developed countries. And that's where, unfortunately, developed countries have not stepped up and delivered as much as they have promised. And that remains a big challenge because developing countries, don't see a good faith effort on the part of those countries who have actually been the major source of the problem to begin with. So until that's solved, I think we're not going to make the kind of progress that we need to make. And we need to make it in this decade to keep below 1.5 degrees. We're very close to already exceeding 1.5 degrees. We've already heated up by 1.2 degrees from pre-industrial levels. So we don't have a lot of time. I'll stop there. Next question. I don't know if I answered the question.
Oh yes, definitely. It's what affected me in your response, Dr. O'Connor, was the fact that number one, it really goes deep into the skin, if I may say so. The thing is, this really affects bodies and humans. Although the fight, I guess, is or the happening will have to happen in terms of politics, in terms of nations and their relations. And in fact, one of the papers in the previous issue in which your article is included had to do with how the current dispensation, I'm sorry to mention that, but the current dispensation here in the country has also encouraged the building of a few facilities that cater to fossil fuels or utilize fossil fuels. So it is a journey that we will have to undertake more seriously, and I agree with you on that, sir. There is a question from. You want to respond to that, sir? Sorry.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say I remember, when I was in the Philippines, but soon after, the Philippines was experienced, as many developing countries, serious problems of brownouts and power outages, shortages of electricity, and that is a big challenge in many developing countries, and countries are trying their best to respond. And at the time, I think the Philippines was using as much quick built natural gas as possible for power generation. Because they can, natural gas facilities can be built fairly quickly. And I guess it was importing LNG from Indonesia. I guess the Philippines has some natural gas of its own, but I don't think it's that large a supply. But anyway, one can sympathize with that because people need power, economies need power to function. And if you don't have it, you don't have it. And, and the good thing is that compared to coal, natural gas is better. It's less polluting, less carbon emissions per British thermal unit or other measure of energy. So it's, between coal and natural gas, yes, natural gas is the preferred alternative. But eventually, we've also got to think about how we're going to phase out natural gas. And that's going to be challenging.
Okay.
Including in the United States, for sure, because the United States has relied a lot on natural gas in the last couple of decades with fracking, which has opened up huge new gas fields in Pennsylvania and other parts of the country.
Thank you very much, Dr. O'Connor. If we may move on to other questions that have come up, there are, I think, there's a lot of engagement today. One question, sir, comes from an independent researcher. If the global climate question is no longer scientific but an economic one, and the dominant existing economic model remains capitalist, and the capitalist model's bottom line remains that of profit, then what alternative economic mechanisms, if not the system itself, may be brought about that address the climate crisis?
Well, I don't know that it's a matter of another economic system completely, because you can make profits from generating renewable energy and from building electric vehicles, but the incentives have not been right. Governments have to set the framework and make it costly for business as usual, for companies to continue to use and to burn, oil and gas or coal. And so once governments set the proper incentives, and it's up to governments to lead on this, then companies will find a way to make a profit from renewable energy. There are plenty of renewable energy companies making profits in the world today, from Ibersola in Spain to Denmark, companies in Denmark who supply wind turbines, and Chinese companies who are making wind turbines and solar panel arrays. So that's not a problem. You can make profits as long as you have the right policy framework and right incentives.
Okay, so if I understand,
and right now, governments are still subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, but to hundreds of millions of dollars a year in subsidies going to exploration, to extraction of fossil fuels. It's totally nonsensical, and also to the consumption of fossil fuels. So those subsidies, in the first instance, need to be removed or substantially reduced, targeted if it's a matter of poor people being able to afford kerosene in India, for example, then target the subsidies very specifically to people who really need them, and don't provide broad subsidies to rich people who don't need subsidies and you don't want them to be consuming more energy, basically. You want them to be consuming less. Poor people need more energy, rich people need less energy consumption, basically.
Right. So thank you for that response, Dr. O'Connor. It really seems this time that I guess if I'm interpreting your response correctly, although our independent researcher asks about capitalism, I suppose that there is a balance of different economic models necessary, and it's not just economic models that we're thinking about, but also I don't know, ethics, or even because that kind of talk admittedly reminded me of Pope Francis's I think Laudato Si, the call to to care for the shared home, and because you don't talk about just something that's an equal sharing, but something equitable, sir.
Absolutely. Yeah, Laudato Si was a major moral clarion call, I should say, for the international community. And in fact, Pope Francis, came to the United Nations when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. He was very much in support of the SDGs broadly, and of strong action on climate change specifically. And he's very sensitive to the inequities in the world between rich and poor countries, between rich and poor people within countries, and the injustice of the patterns of consumption that we see in the world, which are skewed towards high energy consumption by the rich and energy poverty of hundreds of millions of people. Notably in Africa, but not only. Certainly in the Philippines, there's also still energy poverty in places, and in other parts of Asia. And sorry, go ahead.
Yes, so that's thank you very much for that, sir. We'll proceed to the other questions. I think the audience just got excited, and yes, in the comment section of our Facebook page or our broadcast today, there's a question from Dr. Fabian Dairit, Toby Dairit. Thank you for your excellent, wide-ranging talk. Since all of the SDGs are interrelated, is there a particular SDG that is most strategic to address?
That's a good question. Yeah, hello, Professor Dairit. Good to have you on the call. Toby was my colleague in Ateneo. And I don't think that one can answer that categorically. I mean, if you were a neoclassical economist, you would say, of course, there's one that's most important. It's SDG 8 about economic growth. If you get economic growth, everything else follows. I mean, that's the standard neoclassical economic argument. And so, I'm not taking that position, but, one could, I suppose, if one were, a strict neoclassical, take that position. Educators say, of course, it's education. Education is critical for everything, and it's so obvious. And of course, the doctors and the health professionals say, of course, it's health. Health is fundamental. And look at the world we're in when we don't have good health, when we have a pandemic, everything else falls apart. So there are many entry points. Gender equality, the women's movement and UN Women will argue that gender equality has a leveraging effect because educated mothers raise healthy and educated families and successful children and so on. And so I don't necessarily want to take the position of one is more important than the other. I think it depends on I think each person can find an entry point to the SDGs and say, for me, this is the most important, and I'm an educator or I'm a doctor, and I'm going to use this entry point to try to leverage and make progress across as many of the other SDGs as possible. So education, it's extremely important to attacking intergenerational poverty. If kids don't have good education, they're going to be in the same poverty of their parents, almost certainly. And so that's the way to try to give them a route out of poverty. But if they're chronically ill, they're also handicapped in terms of their education. If you're always sick, if you're malnourished, you can't get a decent education. So these are all interrelated. And so it's very hard to say one is absolutely more important than the other. It's basically a set of goals which provide an entry point for everybody. Wherever your starting point is, whatever your expertise is, you can contribute to achieving this integrated and transformative agenda.
Okay, so thank you for that, Dr. O'Connor. I'll follow that up with a question from one of our professors in the University of Santo Tomas, Jenny Ortuoste. Okay, so hello. How can we tie up Dr. O'Connor's points to corporate social responsibility programs here in the Philippines? How can we reach SDGs, create appropriate CSR programs in relation to climate change, risk reduction, and mitigation? So the context of our question asker is she teaches 2 CSR classes in the university, and she is interested to learn how the college can or the university can address the move to have these kinds of CSR programs. Right.
Great. Well, I'm glad you're teaching that. That's fantastic. Well, I guess you are aware, Professor, and others perhaps, that the international CSR movement, if you will, has taken on board the SDGs and integrated the SDGs into the existing reporting initiatives and frameworks that have been used to evaluate the environmental and social performance of corporations. For example, the Global Reporting Initiative. I believe it has adapted its gold standard to include the SDGs and evaluating how companies are performing against delivering on the various goals. So if you are not aware of that, then I would point you towards those initiatives. The UN Global Compact, another initiative involving corporations and corporate social responsibility. Again, aligned now to the SDGs. There was also an initiative undertaken by the financial sector a couple of years back, and I don't know where it stands today. I haven't checked lately, but it's called the Global Benchmarking Initiative. And basically, what it was is an effort by the financial sector to come up with a scoring system for the largest corporations in any given industry, whether it's food and beverages or textiles and clothing or chemicals or whatever it might be, to be able to score them according to how consistent their policies and practices are with the goals and targets of the SDGs, and then to rank them according to that performance. So, company in X in the chemical industry is 99 out of 100 of the top companies in terms of its delivery on the SDGs, or it's number one or number two, whatever. And then that would give investors information which they could then, if they wanted to screen their investments, institutional investors, for example, the University of the Philippines Pension Fund, for example, is investing its money somewhere. Where is it investing its money? Is it investing its money in socially responsible companies in the Philippine Stock Exchange, or in irresponsible companies, or what? And so you can use that ranking to screen your portfolio and direct it towards socially responsible companies. I guess you may have an equivalent in the Philippines, but there are these international efforts underway. And if you don't already have your own initiatives in the Philippines, you could align with these international initiatives, or perhaps you've already done that. I don't know.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. O'Connor. Let me move to a question in relation to the Philippine situation by Professor Randy Tuanyo of the Ateneo de Manila University. Given that the Philippines is contributing relatively less to the global carbon emissions, shouldn't a sustainability plan for the country focus away from a greenhouse gas inventory approach and instead on strengthening resilience and adaptation strategies in the country? So, for example, instead of immediately moving away from non-renewables, but rather ensuring reliable, secure, and affordable power, which includes renewables in the power mix. I think this question, Dr. O'Connor, is related to our technical head, Francis Kilantang's comment that it is somehow not fair for the Philippines to be, I think, given certain recommendations as opposed to, and I think you touched on this already, that there's a difference in the way the Philippines should respond to these climate change issues as compared to other countries which are, more wealthy and more well off. So there.
Well, yeah, I take your point, and I think it's a good one. And I don't think anybody is expecting the Philippines or other countries at its level of per capita income to phase out fossil fuels at the same rate as the United States, or even for that matter, as China. So that's not an issue. I mean, certainly the Philippines, has to have more time to make this transition if needed. The economics, though, is becoming such that it doesn't make sense anymore to be investing in fossil fuels in many contexts because it's cheaper to invest in renewable energy. Of course, a lot of that depends on the intermittency issues and whether you have affordable battery storage at scale for, power plant scale battery storage. And that too is becoming much more affordable over time. The founder of Tesla, the electric vehicle company, Elon Musk in the United States, he also has been developing these large battery farms for power generation so that you have storage and you can use that storage when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing to generate renewables. There's also stored hydro. Basically, in the Philippines has hydro. I don't know what its total potential is, but I know it's got significant hydro in parts of the country at least. And so what you can do is when the sun is shining, pump the water uphill to fill the reservoir. And when the sun isn't shining, then use the water to power, turbines basically and generate hydropower. So there are many options and they're becoming more and more economical. And so, if it's less costly to make renewable energy power plants, then why on earth would you go and build a coal-fired power plant? I mean, just from the economics of it alone, it wouldn't make any sense. I'm not saying that's always the case in the Philippines today, but it's likely to become more attractive in the future to invest in renewables than in fossil fuels. But certainly the Philippines has to be worried about the impacts of climate change because it is so vulnerable, and including the impact on power plants and on infrastructure more generally and building resilience. I fully agree with that. So I don't have any objection to that point at all, but except to say that, I'm not sure that the economics will support just continuing to invest in fossil fuels indefinitely. So, and time is of the essence. Yes, the Philippines isn't the biggest emitter by far, but, everybody at some point is going to have to bite the bullet. It may be by 2050, but still, at some point, nobody is talking about phasing out reliance on fossil fuels completely before 2050. Even the United States, is going to have a stretch to do that. So we can't expect the Philippines to be going faster than the United States or Europe or other developed countries.
Okay, thank you very much for it. So it's talking of equitability or proportionality. I think that's one of the ideas that came out from the explications of Dr. O'Connor today. There's a follow-up question from Dr. Dairit. I think it moves to a different aspect of this topic. Alternative methods of measuring growth have been suggested as an alternative to GDP. How far are financial institutions from adopting a measure that considers environment and human development?
Good question. I mean, the measurements are there already. I mean, the OECD produces a measure of well-being that includes GDP, but includes multiple other variables to do with human health and human happiness and the environment and so on. So for all of the OECD countries and those partners of the OECD, including China and a number of other emerging economies, those data already exist. Those indicators already exist. And other countries could emulate that and replicate that if they chose to do so. I think that's not the problem. I mean, international institutions are pretty savvy in that regard. The UN Development Program, its Human Development Indicator or Index, they've adapted that to include environmental and even inequality dimensions of human development in a broader measure of well-being. Already the HDI is going beyond GDP as a single measure of economic well-being. But that still isn't enough. And so they've adapted the HDI lately to include environmental and inequality types of concerns, which is getting close to what the OECD is doing with its human well-being index. And there are others out there, and there are numerous papers on this. I think the problem is that finance ministries are still run by economists who get their PhDs at MIT and Harvard and Chicago in the standard neoclassical economic tradition, and they're not interested in anything beyond GDP, basically, and they make the decisions about how money gets spent and how policy gets made at the macro level. And so you've got to change the whole economics profession, and it's changing very, very slowly to make much of a difference in terms of measuring progress in terms which actually translate into policy, macroeconomic policy. All they care about is the growth number, the inflation rate, basically, and that's about it. The employment number. Those are they have a very simple worldview, basically. And simplicity is sometimes good. Scientists like to hone down things to their essentials. Well, economists are very good at doing that, but then they miss a good part of the picture oftentimes. I mean, there are economists who specialize in other areas. There are environmental economists. There are labor economists. There are all kinds of economists, but they're niches. They're not the ones who are sort of running the central bank or the Ministry of Finance. So that's a bit of the challenge, I think. And those are the ones who go to the IMF and become the vice presidents of the IMF and so on. So it's a small world, but even the IMF has broadened its view lately. The current president, you call her, director of the IMF, is a woman who comes from a sustainable development background and is very interested in broader considerations, including climate policy and climate change. And the IMF has been advocating for a minimum global carbon price to be not for everybody. The Philippines wouldn't have to sign up for that, but at least the big emitters, the 20 largest economies who account for 80% of global emissions, the G20, should be signing up to put a minimum price on carbon, at least to give some incentive to shift away from dependence on fossil fuels. And so that's a serious discussion now, and the UN is beginning to engage in discussions on that as well. So there is stuff happening out there, and there have been good economists from day one who have known about climate change and done work on climate change, but sometimes their work has been just so conservative as to not really light a fire under governments to do what they need to do. Like, for example, Bill Nordhaus at Yale, who is the father of climate change economics. But until fairly recently, his arguments were, well, we can take our time, we have plenty of time, and technology will save us, but technology is expensive now, so wait until technology becomes cheaper, and then we can invest in transitioning away from fossil fuels. And of course, those who sort of followed his lead wasted a whole lot of time that we don't have anymore to make this transition. And of course, the quicker you have to make the transition, the more costly it is. Obviously, if you have to reduce emissions by 50%, it's a whole lot more costly to do that in 5 years' time than it is in 50 years' time or 20 years' time. So we're running out of the time, and that means the costs are mounting. The costs of taking action are mounting very rapidly. Fortunately, the costs of alternative energy are going down at the same time. So they're counterbalancing one another to some extent.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. There's another question and a set of comments from Professor Rex Barrer. I believe that Professor Barrer was formerly from Greenpeace International and is currently with the Ateneo de Manila School of Government. So he thanks you for your presentation and says, this decade, dubbed as the decade of action, is critical given the urgency meeting the targets set for the SDGs and the Paris Agreement separately, especially as they dovetail in SDG 13, climate change action, while also are intertwined with the other SDGs. However, realistically, we know that soft laws require the cooperation of states, and given likely conflicting priorities and interests, industry itself pursues actions that are intended to address their own objectives. Given the failure of developed countries to comply with their obligation to climate finance, and the responsibility of industry to recognize its own responsibility in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and even provide supplemental finance, how can we ensure that financial commitments will eventually be met and can hasten country action if the NDCs are insufficiently weak, and also how can we achieve targets in SDG 13? So I think that's a very specialized question, but yes.
Wow, it's a big
wonderful.
question.
It is wonderful.
Yeah, very, very good question. Well, I mean, that comes back to what I just intimated about the need for stronger policy measures, but also stronger measures by the private sector, and in particular by the financial sector. But coming first to the policy measures, the professor that I mentioned, I think someone who said he was going to be on the call, I'm not sure if he is, was his research assistant back, or teaching assistant back when we were at Yale, Dick Nordhaus. I mentioned Dick Nordhaus, the climate economist. He wrote an article about, 10 years ago or so, about climate clubs, he called them, and basically saying that we can't possibly achieve an effective agreement to deal with this free rider problem of climate change, where basically, everybody wants everybody else to be the one to take action and to benefit from others' action, but not to take action themselves, basically. He said, we need a couple of countries to get together, countries that matter in terms of dealing with the problem, that is big emitters, to come together and to agree amongst themselves to form a club. And basically, these members of the club, there will be certain rules. And one of the rules is that we would all be willing to impose a minimum price on carbon. Of course, the other rules is that we exclude people who aren't going to put a minimum price on carbon, right? So you have to have some penalties for those who aren't members of the club. And is this approach viable? Is it better than Paris, or is it consistent with Paris even? The argument in this paper that was written by some very good economists at the IMF is, yes, it is consistent with Paris in principle, because a few countries could get together and decide. It could be the United States and the European Union. Hopefully China would be one of them as well, because China is pretty important in this whole discussion. Maybe India would not be willing to come along at first, but so you have a club of a few countries who really matter in terms of global emissions, and they say we'll put a minimum price of $20 per ton on carbon or whatever, okay? And then they write that into their updated nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. So the US updates its nationally determined contributions. It says we're going to put a $20 price on carbon, minimum price. China does the same. The EU does the same. So everybody is still submitting their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, but each of those of this club is consistent, and they're all saying the same thing. We're putting a minimum price on carbon, okay? And then others can join and say, okay, we want to do the same thing. It's not mandatory. Philippines doesn't have to do it right away, but may decide in 5 or 10 years, yeah, we want to do that as well. And there are benefits to doing that, because we can get technology from those who are part of the club. We can get financing. We can do things which we can't do with others, because you have to be a part of the club to benefit from, the transfer of technology or from finance. So those are things that are innovative and interesting and could help address this problem at the policy level. And that's, as I said, under active discussion right now. It's not easy, of course, but right now the Paris Agreement is failing, so we need something to make it work. Basically that's the problem. It's not working at the moment. We're falling way short of where we need to be, and this is just one idea. I'm sure there are others out there. So coming now to the financial sector, and this corporate social responsibility issue, and corporate social responsibility is nice, but it's kind of soft. Companies need to get more serious about their core business and what they're doing. Because, for example, Chase Bank in the United States, okay, they like to talk about their social responsibility, but they're the biggest financier of building new coal-fired power plants around the world. Okay, so how is that consistent with their corporate social responsibility? I don't know, but maybe you can square that circle somehow. So the financial sector has to get serious and discipline itself and police itself as a group, as a club. Say, okay, the top 10 financial institutions in the world are going to stop financing new coal-fired power plants. End of story. There are organizations already doing that. The World Bank has said it's not going to finance any. China has said it's not going to finance them overseas anymore. I don't know, but that's strong action. You have to make strong commitments, and you have pressure. It may not be through regular. Enforce it if it's going to work. Peer pressure can work. It's not as effective as regulatory pressure and penalties, but it can be a means of coercing or coaxing good behavior on the part of the financial sector. You have also more formal efforts to get the financial sector in line, like the disclosure of climate risks. The Group of 8, I think it's called, this global financial stability forum, which was set up, I think, during the last financial crisis, or maybe before then, I'm not quite sure. They created a task force to look at disclosure requirements for financial institutions. How exposed are they to climate risk, either because of the risks of climate damages to the corporations that they're financing, whether it be agricultural corporations or other companies who are exposed to the impacts of climate change, real estate, whatever, or through regulatory risk. For example, they're financing fossil fuel companies, and governments are about to put a carbon tax on fossil fuels. And so that's a risk. If they are exposed to those, they have to report them so that those who are investing in them know what the risks are of those investments. Those are the kinds of things that can be done and are being done, although clearly nothing is being done fast enough and with enough ambition, in my view. But I think I've stopped being visible. Have you heard me or not?
We've heard you, sir. We've heard you. I'm glad that the video is back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry if I didn't fully answer the question, but I think I tried my best, at least for now.
Yes, I think in when we teach writing, sir, sometimes we have this. I think they call it a wicked problem, and it's such a wicked. The whole thing is such a wicked problem that there are so many strands that get tied together like a plate of spaghetti. And sorry for the sad metaphor, but it's really a mess. Yeah, and I think you've addressed the many of the concerns very well, sir. And it's really a complicated matter. I would like to read two questions, and I think this is very much related. It's more like it will appear like comments now because they're very related to the previous response and the question given.
Sure,
but
sure.
these are from Thamashan, sir. I believe that's Rona Alondra, and to be followed by a comment and question by Jericho Roldan. So gas companies, according to Rona, raked in billions of dollars in profit last year, and gas prices seem to keep hiking instead of making it affordable. Third world countries like the Philippines suffer the most. Are there proposed checks and balances to prevent corporate greed? And on the other hand, there's also this question from Jericho. I'll read it because they're related. As the world transitions to renewable energy sources, are there measures or do you have proposed policies to prevent monopolization of the resources needed for this transition to renewable energy?
Okay, those are good questions. With regard to gas, I mean, I think that gas prices have been going up very steeply as oil prices have in the last year and a half, which has been a function to some degree of the recovery from the pandemic. There's sharp recovery in demand. So I don't know that it's a question of monopoly. It's a matter of supply and demand. Of course, there is market power in this industry, and I'm not saying that there isn't some monopoly pricing going on or oligopoly pricing. But I mean, I mentioned earlier the matter of fossil fuel subsidies, and I don't know about the Philippines, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Philippine government provides some kind of fuel subsidies or energy subsidies for poor people who otherwise would have a hard time to be able to afford, gas. Maybe it's in the form of subsidized propane tanks or whatever it is. I'm not quite sure, but I know a lot of countries do that, including Indonesia. I would be surprised if the Philippines isn't doing it. And it's hard to phase those out because poor people need a minimum amount of energy to have a decent standard of living. And I don't think anybody should be talking about doing that. But a lot of the subsidies are very, very broad subsidies to to reduce the price of gasoline at the pump. Well, who buys most of the gasoline at the pump? Not poor people. I mean, of course, jeepney drivers buy gasoline and poor people ride jeepneys. Yes, okay. But Mercedes-Benzes and others are buying a whole lot more gasoline. And so you don't want to be subsidizing rich people to buy fuel. You want to target the subsidies to the people who really need them. And that can be done through clever and wise policy. So that would be my suggestion for the first question. And refresh my memory on the second question now, because I've sort of lost my train of thought. I know it's related.
Yes, sir.
But yeah.
Yes, I will read that again. That's from Jericho Roldan. As the world transitions to renewable energy sources.
Oh yeah, monopolizing yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Well, there is some risk always of I mean, companies compete and they try to establish temporary monopolies. Sometimes they establish permanent monopolies, but not usually, because if they get too rich from high profits, then somebody's going to come in and compete away their profits. That's the way capitalism works. So renewable energy is a case in point. There are a lot of competitors in the renewable energy space. Does that mean that there's an infinite number of competitors? Of course not. You need know-how, you need technology, you need to take risks, and you have to mobilize the investment capital and so on. But there are new firms in the renewable energy space which never existed before. It's not Exxon and Chevron who are the big leaders in renewable energy. Not at all. They're followers. They're catch-up people. It's basically the wind turbine producers in Denmark and the Tesla, Elon Musk, who's an upstart entrepreneur. He's a rich man now. He's been very successful, but he's not rich because he's the head of Mobil or Exxon. He's rich because he's set up a very successful electric vehicle manufacturer. And yes, his vehicles are too expensive for most people to afford. But that's the way innovation works. When you have a new market, generally it's the rich people who pioneer the market when it's very expensive still, and they drive down the prices over time. And electric vehicles will become more and more affordable. Chinese companies are producing electric vehicles. Indian companies are producing electric vehicles. I wouldn't be surprised if there are startups in the Philippines producing electric vehicles or joint ventures with overseas investors. You know, this is an open space. It's got tremendous opportunities. And yeah, some of it will become dominated by a few players. But right now, the big players, the auto industry big players, GM and Ford, are way behind. You know, they're playing catch up. So that's a good thing, basically, that we have new entrepreneurs, new innovators who are entering these new industries. And there are opportunities there in the Philippines and other countries as well.
Okay, thank you, Dr. O'Connor, for that. So I think from what I've gotten, yes, there are many concerns, but it's an open field and there's a lot of room for development and growth. Yes, yes. And at the same time, maybe as a last thing that you could, if I may ask one last thing, maybe because I'm as I've told you, sir, I'm into music and in arts. Would you
Right.
have any? Would you have observed anything in our field that intersects with economics and politics and has already been beneficial to the goals of the SDGs and climate change? So since you talk about this complicated mix that is a process and is necessary to address our situation, have you observed anybody having this kind of a combination, preferably somebody related to arts or music or whatever, that so that maybe somebody like me who's involved with these things can be encouraged to participate, not just because we're feeling the heat literally, but because we are, because our own discipline plays a part.
Right. Good question. Personally, all I know about in this space, but I'm sure that's a much bigger space, is that every year artists, some of these are big name artists, a lot of them, but anyway, get together for a global citizen festival. This last year, it was held in many different cities around the world. Normally, it's held in New York and Central Park in September, at the time when the General Assembly of the United Nations opens its business. But this last year, they had satellite concerts all over the world, including in Lagos, Nigeria, I believe. And I'm not sure where in Asia, but I'm sure somewhere in Asia there was also a concert. You should do it in Manila next time. And these concerts are to promote the SDGs and promote the fight against poverty and climate change and inequality, basically. And they bring together, Beyonce and all of these big name artists are there. Now, of course, you may not be on the stage with Beyonce, but there's plenty of things that you can do nevertheless. I think that, youth are going to be critical, youth in all fields, not just in music and arts, but all fields, to tackling this problem. You have the youth activists like Greta Thunberg. I'm pretty sure that Greta Thunberg must have spawned a number of young musician, activists who have joined her movement. But if not, well, you can always start in the Philippines. There's so much talent in the Philippines artistically. Why not? And I think that one of the biggest challenges with climate change has been the communication, and how do you communicate a message in a complex scientific field? How do you make people understand? It's beginning to impact people's lives in ways that they understand, and that makes it easier, of course. But music and art can certainly facilitate that communication and deepen understanding of the human aspects, the human costs of climate change, and what humans can do to address this challenge. in their own lives. So certainly, I would say go for it.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that very encouraging note. And for somebody like me in the study of music, popular music really has a place in this discourse, and it has a practical role to play, like Beyonce and even Greta Thunberg. And if I'm not mistaken, she sang "Love on Top," so now it's climate on top of everything. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. O'Connor, for this informative lecture. Surely our co-scholars in music, in economics, and political science, and literature have found something very interesting to explore. We would like to present you with the following certificate. So let me read the text of the certificate for you. Unitas Authors International Lecture Series awards the Certificate of Appreciation to Dr. David O'Connor for sharing his knowledge and expertise as the speaker for the third installment of the Unitas Authors International Lecture Series titled The Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Response to Climate Change, conducted on March 11, 2022, signed Professor Maria Luisa T. Reyes, PhD, Editor-in-Chief of Unitas and President of Cultural, Literary, and Arts Study Society Incorporated. So thank you very much. Maraming salamat po, Dr.
Maraming
O'Connor.
salamat po sa inyong lahat.
Yes, salamat po. And
namaste.
Salamat po. Namaste. So maybe one day you can visit the Philippines again when all is better, and it will be, this topic is definitely a rich field of discussion that is urgent. So thank you. Let me just proceed with some announcements from Unitas. This lecture series will run from February until April. The fourth installment is scheduled on March 31 to be delivered by Mr. Juan Miguel Leandro Quizon, who is taking his doctoral studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. His lecture will be based on his Unitas article, Dictatorship's Temporal Edifice, Ang Bagong Lipunan or the New Society's International Airport, published in volume 94, number 2, November 2021. So if you're interested to see connections between this talk of Dr. O'Connor and the Philippines, I think it is good to attend this talk of Mr. Quizon, of Professor Quizon on the Marcoses and the way environment somehow another aspect of this issue has to do with cultural diplomacy and also the way our workers were exploited, and at the same time how they ravaged the environment, the Marcoses, I mean. So again, you are all invited. Please watch out for our invitation and for the registration link that will be posted on the Unitas Facebook page and will be sent to you via email. So Unitas would like to thank the thousands of viewers. Maraming salamat po for being with us, for asking interesting and provocative questions, contributing to the discussion, or just listening quietly, reflecting, and taking down notes about what has been said. Again, please of Unitas and class and Critica Cultura as well. This is Nico Vitug. Thank you and good morning. See you all on March 31. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.